This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church heading?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 20 of the Naked Mormonism podcast. I'm Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. The last couple of episodes were done in the interim time that I was actually just spending on vacation, and they were both discussion episodes with listeners that happened to be amazing supporters of the show. So once again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you, Demonista, Preston, and Melissa, for giving your time for the interview and, lending your voices to the Naked Mormonism information kingdom. Your contributions will forever be known and appreciated by me and everybody who listens to the show. Well, let's get into why everybody listens to this podcast in the first place. The history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The last historical episode was a small scratch on the surface of the Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthoods, and, of course, their evolution through the beginning of the church up to today. It's worth noting that there is way more nuance than can be covered in a single episode. So we'll talk more about Joe's evolving authority claims as they become relevant in the story. But for now, you know the beginning, and that's enough to advance the timeline. Let's talk about the Book of Mormon being published. Last time we were talking about the timeline of the narrative, Joe and company were all in the Whitmer house in Fayette, New York, and they were just finishing up the first draft of the Book of Mormon manuscript. This put us up to the middle of June 1829. Well, the Book of Mormon wouldn't be completed and published until March of 1830, so we have a 9-month period there to cover before the Book of Mormon was unleashed upon the world, and the first congregation of the Church of Christ was convened on April 6, 1830. So, was everybody just standing around while the book was being printed? Not even hardly at all. The only real example we have of laziness during this time was that of Joe himself, and that was due to the pyramid power structure that he had built with his little cronies doing all of the footwork for him. Let's review who Joe had under his control by this point. He had started early on with, of course, his own family. The most credulous actors were his younger and older brother, which were Samuel and Hiram Smith, respectively. And then we had Joseph Smith Sr., who we call Big Daddy Cheese. He also played a bit of a side role through most of the history of the church, but he was definitely there the entire time until he died in 1840 in Nauvoo. Big Daddy Cheese had really primed Joe with his own magic worldview, and it basically imprinted on Joe. Of course, with Joe being as intelligent as he was, he took that worldview and expounded on it to the point that his own father was taking notes from, his crazy revelatory batshit. So there were the 3 closest family members Joe was working with. Lucy Mack Smith, Joe's mom, obviously played a very small role, and she was there the entire time as well. So next, Joe wrangled in Joseph Knight Sr., Bossman Josiah Stowell, Not-So-Smarty Marty Martin Harris, Emma Smith, his wife, Oliver Cowdery, as we know him, Ollie Cowdung all over, D-Day David Whitmer, Peter Jr., Christian, John, and Peter Whitmer Sr. The rest of the Whitmer family was also along for the ride, but the church makes very little or no mention of them, so we'll just kind of ignore them or push them to the side until they distinguish themselves or become relevant. There were plenty of other players that had popped in and out of the storyline by this point, but they weren't particularly making themselves useful yet. So we'll talk about them when the storyline comes up. Names like Hingepin Sidney Rigdon, Hiram Page, and Orrin Porter Rockwell were just a few of the people in this category. In episode 18, we covered the 2 different accounts of the 11 witnesses. The exact date on this sighting experience was never recorded, so we're left with assuming that it happened in mid-June of 1829. We also tend to believe that it was done in 2 different settings, that Joe got the witness testimony from the Whitmer family and Hiram Page in the Whitmer house, and we think that when Joe moved back from Fayette to Palmyra, that's when he got the signatures of his father and his brothers. So the next 2 months ended up being pretty action-packed here after June 1829. Joe and Emma moved back into the Smith house in Palmyra from the Whitmer house in Fayette, which was a distance of about 25 miles. This was done for a couple of reasons. Joe couldn't go back to the Hales in Harmony, Pennsylvania just yet. The entire Hale family hated Joe, and he'd skipped out on the mortgage note that he signed with Isaac, Emma's father. Joe had to give the Hale family some time to cool down, and of course he needed to return there only after he had made some real, demonstrable progress on the Book of Mormon. There was another reason Joe and Emma moved to the Smith house in Palmyra. It was pretty much the only place that Joe could live surrounded by people that believed and supported him, and by extension, of course, they protected him. He couldn't get any real work done on his pride and joy, the Book of Mormon, if he was surrounded by naysayers and dissenters, like at the Hale house. Joe had probably worn his welcome pretty thin in the Whitmer house. I mean, not only was he not working or contributing to the household, but he introduced 3 new mouths to feed and took John Whitmer and D-Day David Whitmer away from their regular household duties to help him translate the book. Joe was just a fucking parasite on anybody that was willing to give him a shoe in their door. The final reason for moving back to Palmyra was not so smarty Marty. Joe had received the glorious confirmation from Marty that he could see the angel holding the plates when they were experiencing the account of the 3 witnesses. This signified Marty's commitment to pay the tab of whatever printing press ended up publishing the Book of Mormon. Publishing a book takes a lot of management from the author and financier of the book, and Marty would never move from his established farm and home, just, to oversee publishing this book. So, moving back to Palmyra was literally the only solution for Joe and Emma. And of course, the now homeless Oliver Cowdery, Ollie Cowdung, had to come along too for various legitimate reasons that we'll talk about in a second. Upon this move back to the Smith home, Joe kept on Marty pretty hard to get the book published, just like Marty had promised. Of course, they didn't just accept the first printer's bid as soon as it came in, they had to do a little bit of shopping. Their first stop was at the printing press of Egbert B. Grandin, the local publishing house and printing press and bookstore in Palmyra. Grandin's bid came in at 60 cents per book, including the binding, and that equated to $3,000 for the 5,000 copies. This was unfortunately a bit high because, Palmyra was a small town, and the Grandin Publishing Company was the only game in town. No competition allowed Grandin to set the price wherever he really saw fit. So with this dollar figure in the back of their minds, Joe and Marty continued on down the road to check out some other possibilities. The Wayne Sentinel was the name of the local Palmyra newspaper that was published by the Grandin Publishing Company. When Joe and Marty told Egbert Grandin that they wanted to do some shopping around for a better price, once, Grandin put his bid in, the Wayne Sentinel decided to publish an article about them on June 26, 1829. I honestly don't think that Grandin was aware at this time that Joe and Marty would ultimately come back and employ his company to publish the Book of Mormon, because the article says some, choice words about their conquest. I pulled this from The Rise of Mormonism by H. Michael Marquardt, but he originally got it from Dan Vogel's Early Mormon Documents, Volume 2. It's the Wayne Sentinel newspaper article. Quote, "Just about in this particular region, for some time past, much speculation has existed concerning a pretended discovery through superhuman means of an ancient record of a religious and divine nature and origin, written in ancient characters, impossible to be interpreted by any to whom the special gift has not been imparted by inspiration. It is generally known and spoken of as the Golden Bible. Most people entertain an idea that the whole matter is the result of a gross imposition and a grosser superstition." End quote. I personally find it hilarious that the Grandin Publishing Company would allow this article to be printed using their press if, well, they were planning on doing the Book of Mormon job. If we adjust for inflation, this $3,000 job in 1829 equates to just over $76,900 today. If a job for that much money was on the line, would you print a scathing newspaper article about the people that were just about to give you that much money? Grandin allowed some other mistakes when it came to printing the Book of Mormon, but we'll get into those later. Let's come back to what Marty and Joe were up to. The next town they stopped in for a bit was Rochester. At this time, Rochester was the largest city that was relatively close to Manchester and Palmyra, and it was just under 30 miles to get an idea. It was a massive trading hub and a metropolitan area that borders Lake Ontario. And Marty must have thought that printing prices would be considerably cheaper there than in dinky old little Palmyra. The problem with this would be the cost of logistics. Any amount of money saved in the printing cost would be easily soaked up by putting somebody up for 6 months in Rochester and transporting pages of manuscript between the towns while the book was being printed. This is another news article, this time from a Rochester-based publication called The Gem. Then it was published on September 5th, 1829. It's one of multiple similar articles that were published by other newspapers around the same time, and it goes over things we already know up to this point, but it says some other things that are worth talking about briefly. This is pulled from the same section in Dan Vogel's Early Mormon Documents of Volume 2. Quote, "A man by the name of Martin Harris was in this village a few days since endeavoring to make a contract for printing a large quantity of work called the Golden Bible. He gave something like the following account of it." Now the newspaper is paraphrasing Marty. Quote, "In the autumn of 1827, a man named Joseph Smith of Manchester in Ontario County said that he had been visited by the Spirit of the Almighty in a dream, and informed that in a certain hill in that town was deposited a golden Bible, containing an ancient record of divine origin. He states that after a third visit from the same spirit in a dream, he proceeded to the spot, removed earth, and there found the Bible, together with a large pair of spectacles. He had also been directed to let no mortal see them under the penalty of immediate death, which injunction he steadfastly adheres to. The treasure consisted of a number of gold plates, about 8 inches long, 6 wide, and 1/8 of an inch thick, on which were engraved hieroglyphics. By placing the spectacles in a hat and looking into it, Smith interprets the characters into the English language." End quote. Just a couple things to mention there. Where the fuck is the history that we are taught by the church today? This was arguably one of the earliest printed accounts of Joe's story, and I realize that it's not 100% reliable, but it's a local newspaper written by a person that directly interviewed Marty in 1829, before the Book of Mormon was published and before the Church of Christ had started. It has at least some level of credibility, and it seems to leave out some very major details in comparison to today's story. Where was the visitation from God and Jesus in 1820? What about the first angelic visitation in 1823? What about the ancient breastplate that held the Urim and Thummim being found with the plates? Why was the angel called a Spirit of the Almighty, not called an angel, or specifically the angel Nephi or angel Moroni, as in later accounts? It's said that no mortal could see the plates under penalty of instant death, but at this time, supposedly 11 people other than Joe had seen them to a level that was convincing enough to go along with Joe's story. How does one explain these contradictions? This doesn't even mention the inconsistencies with the translation method itself. This article reports that Joe was using rocks in a hat less than 4 months after he was doing so. But even today, in spite of well-established historical fact, the church history cleverly skirts that part of the story. So once again, I ask, where the fuck is the history that I was taught growing up and believing Mormons are taught today? It's sad that a newspaper article from 186 years ago has more historical veracity than the history reported by the church itself today. Alright, digression over. After Joe and Marty decided against the logistical nightmare of commissioning a Rochester printer, they headed back to Egbert Grandin in Palmyra to strike up a deal. On August 23rd, 1829, Not-So-Smarty Marty did his not-so-smartiest move yet, and signed a contract with Grandin, quote, in the consideration of the sum of $3,000, for typesetting, printing, and binding the Book of Mormon. This was secured by a mortgage for the same tract of land or farm upon which the said Martin Harris now resides, end quote, and was to be paid in 18 months. We have an original copy of this contract, and it's currently held by the Wayne County Courthouse in Lyons, New York. Have I recently mentioned how much I love the history of the LDS Church? It's so young and well documented, and there's legally binding court documents that still exist in the handwriting of the actual people that were involved. It's so fascinating, I fucking love it. So once the contract was drawn up, work immediately commenced on the Book of Mormon. Well, on the authorship side anyway. You see, the industrial-sized printing press spit out 16 pages at a time. The tedious nature of the typesetting process was the most time-consuming part of the job. Each line of text was held in a very small rail, and each rail had all the individual letters and punctuation marks placed in reverse order inside these small rails. Each massive printing plate had a bunch of these rails, and it had 16 pages worth of text that was held inside of the rails. Once all the individual letters and punctuations were placed correctly, they were proofread multiple times by the typesetter, in this case that was John H. Gilbert, and then they were mounted for printing. Once these plates were mounted, the printing press machine itself would dip the plate in a massive vat of ink and move a square of 16 pages underneath the plate, and it would press the inked tiles that were the punctuation and letters onto blank pages. A printing and collating job of 5,000 copies of anything would take a current industrial printer maybe a couple of hours to perform at tops. But printing the Book of Mormon was started in August of 1829 and completed in mid to late March 1830. That was 7 months of work for one, possibly two guys working probably 50 or more hours a week just to print Joe's holy dribble known as the Golden Bible. The job would have gone faster if Joe wasn't an unprepared, narcissistic, paranoid neurotic, but Grandin was paid by the page, not the hour, so any hurry that Joe was in to print the book was only created by his own anxiety to start his congregation. Once this contract between Not-So-Smarty Marty and Grandin was signed, a printer's manuscript needed to be created. But of course, Joe and Ollie only had the original manuscript in hand, with dashes and edits and countless spelling errors, making it nowhere near fit to go to the typesetter. The solution to this, of course, was for Ollie to move into the Smith house and help Joe create the printer's manuscript. Peter Whitmer Jr. also moved into the Smith house that was small for just the Smith family alone, but now there were 4 more young adults living in the house with mouths to feed, and they needed places to sleep and everything. You can only imagine how crammed and unpleasant this must have been. There's a little article on LDS.org called A Snug Log House, and it details the dimensions of the log home that these 14 people were stuffed into. It measured about 24 by 36 feet, approximately 850 square feet. and it was one story with 2 rooms and then a small second-story loft for all of the kids to live in together. For my job, I do a route that I repeat every 2 weeks, so I see the same people on the same day in that 2-week rotation. Every time I walk into one of my stops, the very nice lady there asks if I'm married and making kids yet. By this point, it's become a bit of a game between us. She keeps telling me I should give my parents grandkids and that life is so much more fulfilling with children in it. Now, while I don't doubt that, I continually parry her suggestions by simply saying, well, I don't really like kids and I can't imagine any situation in my life right now that would be made better with kids in it. I mean, I'm 24 right now. I'm effectively working 2 full-time jobs, and I can't imagine the thought of having to devote countless sleep-deprived hours and hundreds of thousands of dollars to raising a kid or 2, especially right now in my life. Well, to this lady's credit, she had her first kid when she was 17, and by my age had popped out all 4 of her kids. And she does make some good arguments, don't get me wrong. She's essentially an empty nester now and claims that she couldn't imagine how her life would be different if she didn't have her kids when she had them. She talks about how much joy they've brought to her life over the years and how loved she feels whenever she talks to any of her kids about anything in their, well, now adult lives. She regales me with stories of camping trips and school dances and even sitting on the sidelines at sporting events. And it all sounds fun, but I continue to fire back with, well, it's a lot easier to remember the fun times because that's what sticks with you, right? You don't remember all the shitty diapers, the runny noses, and complaining and whining and disciplining and arguments with your spouse about child rearing and money problems and having to pick up the teenagers from the police station at 2 a.m. and how much the kids hated you during their teenager years and all the myriad other inconveniences and frustrations that come along with raising little versions of yourself. It's just easier to remember the fun times and pass them along to the younger generation as what she considers to be wisdom through her own experience. The reason I bring this up is to shed light on what we consider comfort by today's standards. I live with one roommate in a 3-bedroom, 2-bath bachelor pad that's 2 full floors at about 1,000 square feet per floor, and, it's pretty comfortable. The house is pretty average for one family, but I could never imagine having a main floor that's considerably smaller than this one, an upstairs that's just a single room and way smaller than the main floor, and then trying to squeeze 14 fucking people in it. It's unbelievable to consider the logistics alone. Forget about meals or bath time. I recommend going online and doing a Google search for the Snug Log Home, Palmyra, New York. The plot is owned by the church, and they have a model replica of the home built on the same area the original home was built on. There are dozens of pictures, and they even run guided tours of the place. The tours are, probably about 6 minutes long because you just would walk in the front door and look around and say, wow, this is really fucking small. Then go up the stairs and see the main room that all the kids lived in and say, holy shit, this is really fucking small. And then leave because, well, the next tour is probably on its way and there's no way that 2 full groups of 10 people or however many would fit inside that dinky little shack. You almost have to ask, why the fuck did Big Daddy Cheese and Lucy Mac Mama Cheese decide to have 10 kids growing up in that house? Did they think their lives would get easier with each kid or something? Did they not understand where children came from? I know sex education was despicable or completely non-existent at that time, but they had to get a clue after the first half dozen, right? I talk about all of this for one reason, to show how fucking cramped it really was inside that little place. Before Joe, Emma, Peter, and Ollie moved in, let alone after. Imagine how high the tensions must have ran in the household. I bet every little mannerism that everybody had or every little fart drove every other person in the house fucking nuts. Imagine the arguments and the bickering. God, I can't even fucking think of how shitty that must have been. So anyways, that massive digression is over. So Ollie and Peter Whitmer start transcribing the original manuscript with Joe's help to prepare a printer's manuscript for John Gilbert to use in setting the type plates. The crew was madly scribbling the contents onto the printer's manuscript on foolscap paper, but we've learned in the past they simply neglected to add any punctuation, paragraph, or verse breaks, or even correct most of the spelling errors. Each chapter was one long block sentence and was usually terminated with an amen or a single period before moving on to the next chapter. We read this a couple of episodes ago, but let's go back to John H. Gilbert's memorandum of the situation. This is pulled from Dan Vogel's Early Mormon Documents, Volume 2, page 543. Quote, "When the printer was ready to commence work, Harris was notified, and Hiram Smith brought the first installment of manuscript of 24 pages, closely written on common foolscap paper. He had it under his vest and coat closely buttoned over it. At night, Smith came and got the manuscript, and with the same precaution carried it away. The next morning, with the same watchfulness, he brought it again, and at night took it away. This was kept up for several days. The title page was first set up, and after proof was read and corrected, several copies were printed for Harris and his friends. On the second day, Harris and Smith, meaning Hiram Smith, being in the office, I called their attention to a grammatical error and asked whether I should correct it. Harris consulted with Smith for a short time and turned to me and said, 'The Old Testament is ungrammatical, set it as written.'" End quote. So when I said earlier that Joe was unprepared, paranoid, and neurotic, this was the symptom I was using to make that claim. Joe was so afraid that somebody would lose the manuscript or it would be stolen or read by an untrusted individual that once enough of the printer's manuscript had been completed to start printing, Joe made Hiram, his older brother, tuck the manuscript under his vest and coat and walk to the printer in the morning and make sure nobody would fuck with it. Then Hiram would walk back to the printing office in the evening before closing time and tuck it back safely in his coat and take it back to the Smith home. What an annoyance, right? John Gilbert must have been wondering what the actual fuck was going on here, because this was probably considered really unconventional and at worst time-consuming. A big problem with doing business this way was the time limitation Gilbert had with his typesetting duties during the day. Like I said earlier, the printer's manuscript wasn't punctuated or proofread for typos, so Gilbert had to do all of that himself during the daytime, which was all time that could be spent actually setting the type and getting some work done. Well, Gilbert got fed up with how time-consuming this was and finally said something to Hiram after a few days of the same song and dance. It continues, quote, "After working a few days, I said to Smith on his handing me the manuscript in the morning, 'Mr. Smith, if you would leave this manuscript with me, I would take it home with me at night and read and punctuate it, and I could get along faster in the daytime. For now, I have frequently to stop and read half a page to find out how to punctuate it.' His reply was, 'We are commanded not to leave it.'" End quote. Where do you think that commandment came from? Of fucking course it was Joe. Joe was so paranoid and neurotic that he issued a commandment from God to his older brother Hiram to not leave the manuscript out of his hands overnight with anybody that couldn't be trusted. I think he learned from the whole Martin and Lucy Harris situation. But, I mean, think about it. Was a commandment from God really necessary to make Hiram follow Joe's wishes? Well, we'll see in the future that might just have been the case. If any listeners have older siblings like I do, you know how hard it is to get them to do something you ask, especially when they're irrational and you know you don't really have a good reason for asking them to do it. Well, if you're just a conduit for God, like Joe was, you can just babble some quote-unquote divine revelation, and suddenly older siblings become a lot more motivated to help. That's presumably what happened here. Well, after Hiram had said he was commanded to not leave the manuscript with Gilbert overnight, Gilbert continues on in his memorandum, quote, "A few mornings after this, when Smith handed me the manuscript, he said to me, 'If you will give your word that this manuscript shall be returned to us when you get through with it, I will leave it with you.' I assured Smith that it should be returned all right when I got through with it. For 2 or 3 nights, I took it home with me and read it, and punctuated it with a lead pencil." End quote. This must have made the work go exponentially faster. There's no way of knowing how much longer the printing would have taken if the entire book was printed the way Gilbert first described. You have to understand, most of the publications that Gilbert, or any typesetter for that matter, were working with were complete, proofread, edited final drafts of whatever was about to be printed. But the Book of Mormon was printed from its second draft that was being written while the previous pages were being edited and proofread by Gilbert, who was just a common typesetter. He was by no means a grammatician or professional editor. It's really no wonder why the Book of Mormon was such a fucking mess when it was printed in 1830, and it's gone through multiple overhauls since then with 4,000 plus changes. The original manuscript must have been incomplete monkey shit thrown at paper with some lines drawn through it or something before it was transcribed into the printer's copy. Fuck, I really want to see a picture or photocopy or the actual thing. I mean, why did Joe have to bury it in the cornerstone of the Nauvoo temple? Did he not understand that people studying his religion later on might want to see the original copy of the Book of Mormon? Or maybe he did understand that, and that's why he buried it. I suppose we won't know until, we die and go to Mormon heaven and get to ask Joe in person, while he's on the judgment panel with God and Jesus. So arduous editing wasn't the only problem that plagued Gilbert when he was setting the type for and printing the Book of Mormon. The next problem was either slow work or procrastination on the Smith side of the equation. Ollie, Joe, and Peter were slaving away to try and get the printer's manuscript up and running before Gilbert needed the next set of pages for printing. You see, once the manuscript was edited for printing and the type was set, the actual printing only took a day or two, because it just involved placing blank paper in the press and pulling out and cutting the printed pages into their bindable format. Well, Gilbert caught up to the 3 transcribers and ended up surpassing them in the work. This forced Gilbert to use the original manuscript, warts, blemishes, and all, for nearly a sixth of the entire Book of Mormon. The section he used it for was the last part of Helaman all the way through the end of the Book of Mormon. That's almost 100 pages that Gilbert didn't have a printer's manuscript for. The printer's manuscript itself for those pages was completed after the book was already finished being printed, and some of the words in it vary from the original manuscript that Gilbert used to print the book, meaning the published version of the Book of Mormon in those 100 pages differs from the printer's manuscript, which differs from the original manuscript uttered by Joe and scribed by Ollie and others. What a fucking mess for a single book! Another funny thing about Gilbert's typesetting was when he got to the Isaiah chapters in Nephi. So apparently he was frustrated enough with trying to punctuate and edit the book himself that he actually used a KJV Bible to help him punctuate and edit everything that Joe plagiarized from the Bible. I mean, I would too if it made the job a lot easier, but I just find it funny that Gilbert used the Bible to correct the plagiarisms of the Bible that Joe stole and put in his Book of Mormon in order to edit the book for print. It's just really ridiculous. Another funny addition was the fact that Gilbert corrected some of the punctuation and words mid-print, meaning that sometimes he would set the type, print a couple sets of pages, notice a problem or discrepancy, and change the type for the rest of the print. This means that of the 5,000 copies of the original Book of Mormon, each book could vary from the last by a couple words or punctuation marks. The most correct book on the planet had discrepancies from one copy to the next in its very first printing, and it was copied using relatively modern industrial machinery. The problems with the Book of Mormon doomed this damn little thing from its inception, yet the myth that it's correct by any standard still perpetuates in believing Mormons today, somehow. I will never figure it out. So that's what was happening at the Grandin printing company, but what was going on with Joe and everybody else? That's what we're interested in. Gilbert had said that Oliver, Hiram, and Not-So-Smarty Marty were frequent visitors to the office, but Joe himself never came by but maybe once during the entire publication. Well, the entire Smith family, Joe, Emma, Ollie, and Peter Whitmer, were all living at the Smith home preparing the printer's manuscript for at least a little while anyway. Then, as Joe was prone to do, he set the wheels into motion in his favor and then just fucked off. In fall of 1829, he and Emma moved back to their home on the Hale property in Harmony, Pennsylvania. It isn't really known what Joe was doing day to day there while the Book of Mormon was being printed, but I think we can reasonably assume he was probably mending his relationship with the Hale family and working hard for some real money. And breeding unicorns and baking magic fucking cupcakes to cure cancer, because of fucking course he wasn't working hard to make a living. He was doing his usual Joe shit and probably telling the Hale family how awesome and righteous he was now because his profit aspirations were finally being achieved. He had finished writing the book that Isaac, who was Joe's father-in-law, had been naysaying for so long, and everything else was on autopilot until the book was published. Joe was officially a published author, and nobody would knock him off that pedestal once he scrambled his way to the top of it. In fact, Joe spent a bit of his time during the printing being his own copyright enforcer. Normally, copyright infringement would be enforced by local police, even in that day. But Joe would rather take his vengeance for this, what he would call persecution, into his own hands. Something that I recently found in Dan Vogel's Early Mormon Documents Volume 2 was another newspaper publication that came out of Palmyra, New York. It was called the Palmyra Reflector. It was run by a guy named Abner Cole under the pen name Obadiah Dogberry, and it was a satirical publication that was rather artful in making fun of whatever was big in Palmyra at any given time. This guy dug deep into the bottomless well of Joseph Smith that was ripe for satire. The best part about it, he rented Grandin's printing press on nights and weekends in order to print his paper, meaning that he had free access to the Book of Mormon while it was being printed. He ended up publishing the first couple of chapters of Nephi, which, for the record, he had no right to do, and this is what gave Joe grounds to leave Harmony to visit with this Cole guy in January of 1830. But really, this guy was fucking awesome. He would even write some of his articles in Queen's English like the Book of Mormon and throw in unnecessary "it came to passes" just to fuck with Joe. I'll read a few excerpts from his paper, like I said, pulled from Dan Vogel's Early Mormon Documents. Before reading this excerpt, I'll need to offer some context. Lumen Walters was a well-known treasure seeker and user of scrying stones in Joe's treasure-seeking group. He didn't gain his reputation there, but he was brought from another town where he had a good reputation to do some consulting work with Joe and company. And lo and behold, Joe ended up pulling the plates from the ground soon after his visit. Walters was kind of like Samuel Lawrence or Joseph Knight Sr. in this consultation respect. So Abner Cole, aka Obadiah Dogberry, is credited with writing the first parody of the Book of Mormon, and he called it the Book of Pukei. I'm not really sure if anybody knows what it's in reference to, but it's just spelled puke with I at the end, like Nephi and Lehi and all of the other Abinadis and I's in the Book of Mormon. So yeah, the Book of Pukei. We're going to read a few verses from the first and second chapter of this satirical masterpiece. Quote, "The Book of Pukei, chapter 1, verse 1. And it came to pass in the latter days that wickedness did much abound in the land, and the idle and slothful said to one another, Let us send for Walters the magician, who has strange books, and deals with familiar spirits. Peradventure he will inform us where the Nephites hid their treasure. So be it, that we and our vagabond van did not perish for lack of sustenance." Verse 3, "And the idle and slothful paid tribute unto the magician, and besought him, saying, O thou art wise above all men, and can interpret the book that no man understandeth, and can discover hidden things by the power of thy enchantments. Lead us, we pray thee, to the place where the Nephites buried their treasure, and give us power over the spirit, and we will be thy servants forever. And the magician led the rabble into a dark grove, in a place called Manchester, where after drawing a magic circle with a rusty sword and collecting his motley crew of latterdemalions within the center, he sacrificed a cock for the purpose of propitiating the Prince of Spirits. End quote. So, this guy, Lumen Walters, that Dogberry called Walters the Magician, came in to do some consulting work with the treasure digging group on the hill Cumorah to, I guess, help them find the treasure they'd been seeking for so long. He does this weird ritual that involves reading some Latin passages from a book, drawing a circle in the dirt with a rusty sword, and sacrificing his unblemished cock to the treasure spirits. What in the actual fuck? These were the people that Joe emulated and learned from. Is it any wonder that he had this magic worldview? I mean, let's find out about the outcome of this weird blood ritual here and see if we can draw any parallels. Quote, "All things being ready, the idle and slothful fell to work with a zeal deserving a better cause, and many a livelong night was spent in digging for the root of all evil. Howbeit, owing to the wickedness and hardness of their hearts, these credulous and ignorant knaves were always disappointed, till finally their hopes, although frequently on the eve of consummation, like that of the hypocrite, perished, and their hearts became faint within them. And it came to pass that when the idle and slothful became weary of their nightly labors, they said to one another, Lo, this imp of the devil hath deceived us. Let us no more of him, or peradventure ourselves, our wives, and our little ones will become chargeable on the town." End quote. So, Lumen Walters performed this cock blood sacrifice ritual, and it didn't work for multiple nights in a row. And, like usual, the group of treasure seekers became discouraged and abandoned their campaign. Does this seem familiar at all? Like we've heard this before? Alright, let's finish the chapter and just to see what happens next. Remember, this is just a parody of Joe and his group. The best part about it is how close it follows in line with what we know to have happened by other publications. I love this Dogberry guy. Quote, "Now, when Walters the magician heard these things, he was sorely grieved, and said unto himself, Lo, mine occupation is gone. Even these ignorant vagabonds, the idle and slothful, detect mine impostures. I will away and hide myself, lest the strong arm of the law should bring me to justice." And he took his book, and his rusty sword, and his magic stone, and his stuffed toad, and all his implements of witchcraft, and retired to the mountains near Great Sodus Bay, where he holds communion with the devil, even unto this day. End quote. Beautiful, isn't it? It just tells us so much about the society. Frauds like this, like Walters and Joe, were getting popped left and right by the law because, well, for some reason, people didn't like being lied to when it came to magic rituals and buried treasure, much like today. As we know, Joe actually fell victim to the law for this same damn thing in 1826, but he didn't escape the law like Walters did. He had to stand trial. There's one verse left in the chapter. Let's hear how Dogberry brings things to a close. Quote, "Now the rest of the acts of the magician, how his mantle fell upon the prophet Joe Smith, Jr., and how Joe made a league with the spirit, who afterwards turned out to be an angel, and how he obtained the gold Bible, spectacles, and breastplate, will they not be faithfully recorded in the Book of Pukei?" End quote. Oh my God, I love this guy. He brings it all together in a scathing format, mimicking the Book of Mormon's writing style to tell Joe's story. People with access to a printing press were just as much assholes as they are today, only the medium has changed, and they're called internet trolls. I fucking love it so much. I can't even express how great this is. We have to read some of chapter 2 because Dogberry really gets into it and ends up giving Joe a surname that just can't be ignored. Quote, The Book of Pukei, chapter 2, verse 1. And it came to pass, drink, that when the mantle of Walters the magician had fallen upon Joseph, surnamed the prophet, who was the son of Joseph, that the idle and slothful gathered themselves together in the presence of Joe, and said unto him, Lo, we will be thy servants forever. Do with us, our wives, and our little ones, as it may seem good in thine eyes. I don't think that Joe really had any problem doing what he wanted with his friends' wives and little ones. I mean, I'm just saying. And the prophet answered and said, Behold, hath not the mantle of the Walters the magician fallen upon me? And am I not able to do before you, my people, great wonders, and shew you at a more proper season where the Nephites hid their treasure? For lo, yesternight stood before me in the wilderness of Manchester the Spirit, who from the beginning has had in keeping all the treasures hidden in the bowels of the earth. And I looked, and behold, a little old man stood before me, clad, as I supposed, in Egyptian raiment, except his Indian blanket and moccasins. His beard of silver white hung far below his knees. On his head was an old-fashioned military half-cocked hat, such as was worn in the days of the patriarch Moses. His speech was sweeter than molasses, and his words were the reformed Egyptian. And he again said to me, Joseph, thou who hast been surnamed the Ignoramus, knowest thou not that great signs and wonders are to be done by thy hands? Knowest thou not that I have been sent unto thee by Mormon, the great apostle to the Nephites, Mormon who was chief among the lost 10 tribes of Israel? End quote. It just continues on like that, with little jabs at Joe's character and the entire story of the Golden Bible. Among his multiple publications of the Palmyra Reflector, Abner Cole published the first 2 chapters of the Book of Mormon from January 2nd to January 22nd, which prompted the ire of Joe and company. But once he became aware of the copyright infringement, Joe wasn't going to go through legal means or civil suit to halt the rogue reporter's actions. Joe and company reportedly first became aware of Cole's actions due to a funny feeling that Hiram had, and totally not from the people around town that read the newspaper and were making fun of Joe. This is a piece extracted from Lucy's book, page 470 to 471, originally making it a first-hand account. However, I'm pulling it from The Rise of Mormonism by H. Michael Marquardt, page 152. Quote, Lucy Smith remembered that in January 1830, on one Sunday afternoon, Hiram became very uneasy. He told Oliver that his peculiar feelings led him to believe that something going was wrong at printing office. Sick. Oliver and Hiram went to Grandin's printing establishment and found Abner Cole at work printing a paper which seemed to be a weekly periodical. Hiram discovered that Cole was printing portions of the Book of Mormon in his paper. Mr. Cole, said he, meaning Hiram, what right have you to print the Book of Mormon in this way? Do you not know that we have secured a copyright? Lucy continues, Hiram and Oliver returned immediately home, and after counseling with Mr. Smith, meaning Big Daddy Cheese, it was considered necessary that Joseph should be sent for. Accordingly, my husband set out as soon as possible for Pennsylvania. End quote. So Abner Cole, a.k.a. Obadiah Dogberry, was publishing the Book of Mormon in his own newspaper. That was blatantly illegal, and it was completely wrong. But one might wonder why Joe and everybody else was so offended by it. You would think that a holy text could stand on its own merits, and reading the first couple chapters would spark people's curiosity to know what was going on in the rest of the book. If anything, Cole was doing Joe a favor by exposing everybody that read his paper to a little teaser, or like a trailer of the Book of Mormon. If I was reading this guy's newspaper and he was reporting on a book that was about to come out and I read the first 2 chapters of the book in this newspaper, I would want to read the rest of it, especially after seeing the Book of Pukei, the satirical version of it. I would be so excited to read the actual book. I mean, think about it. The first 2 chapters of the Book of Mormon are some of the most exciting and epic. And it introduces the first hero in the book, Nephi, and his righteous parents and his evil older brothers. Nephi and his brothers go to a rich citizen of Jerusalem's house, before Jerusalem is destroyed, named Laban, who had stolen some brass plates from them. Nephi finds Laban passed out drunk and gets in an argument with God about whether or not to cut Laban's drunk fucking head off. Nephi obeys and puts on Laban's bloody clothes and then tricks a servant of Laban's house to let him into the chamber where they keep the plates and just fucking walks out with the plates in hand. The servant even follows him into the wilderness, thinking the whole time that it's still Laban. He must not have seen the blood-soaked frock. Then the whole family gets together, and the servant's like, what the fuck? But ends up deciding to stay with the family of outlaws. After that, Lehi, who is Nephi's dad, wakes up one morning and finds a magic brass ball in front of his tent with 2 spindles on it that point to where the family is supposed to go, only if they're faithful enough. That's a pretty good hook to get a person to read this crazy, boring fucking book. And Joe was mad at Cole for publishing it? I don't get it. So we don't know the details of the actual interaction, but the Rise of Mormonism finishes the interaction with, quote, Joseph made a trip north from Harmony to talk to Cole and told him to desist from publishing any more from his book. The last issue of the Reflector that printed any text from the forthcoming Book of Mormon was an extra dated January 22nd, 1830. The Smiths maintained control over the printing and sale of the book. End quote. You almost wonder if the reason that Joe didn't want this Abner Cole guy printing excerpts from the Book of Mormon in the newspaper was because it was completely crazy sounding, and you didn't get to see the title page and the preface of Joe saying that I know it's a crazy book, but any problems in it are problems from man, but not of God. And you really wonder how Joe was thinking he could make the book actually sound good. I just can't quite figure that out. After it finishes that paragraph there, it quotes the entire contract that Big Daddy Cheese signed with Not So Smarty Marty, saying they would split the profit of the book sales until Marty was repaid in full. Like I said, this Abner Cole guy was a badass, and he didn't really give half a fuck about Joe's reputation. Maybe he did, and it was just his goal to besmirch that reputation into certain obscurity. Either way, the publication of the Palmyra Reflector, along with the standing opinions of the Smith family with all of the locals in Palmyra and Manchester, made the publication of the Book of Mormon and the genesis of the Mormonite religion a challenge to Joe and company. Joe definitely had people's ignorance and credulity on his side, which ran rampant in that day and age, probably only slightly more so than today, but any person with an ounce of skepticism could shoot holes in Joe's theology all day long. Well, next we're going to learn about a couple of people that lacked that singular ounce of skepticism, but had enough credulity to fill a swimming pool. During the time the book was being printed, Joe and his Golden Bible were all the gossip through Palmyra and Manchester. In addition to that, there were plenty of newspapers writing about him and his wild claims that were spreading the story for miles beyond what word of mouth would travel. Naturally, some people would be curious enough to go talk to Joe and his company just to find out what the actual story was, and not just what the tabloids and gossip were passing along. Well, quite frankly, this probably had something to do with Joe and Emma moving back to Harmony, where Joe was less known. Well, just for the time that the book was being printed. What Mormons today would consider persecution, Joe was probably just enduring an onslaught of tough and legitimate questions from pastors or historians or just any normal person walking down the street. We have record of a few of these people visiting him, but the records that survived are mainly just meetings that affirmed the truthfulness of the prophet in one way or another. We'll read a couple of those accounts in a minute, but it's worth making a distinction first. It's easy to understand why Joe was drawing so much attention. This was the burned over district, and people loved them some new Jesus. Millerites, the Campbellites, Seventh-day Adventists, Anabaptists, and dozens of other crazy religious sects were born in this primordial theological soup. And Mormonism was no different. As soon as somebody had a new take on Jesus, the people would either flock to that faction or wholly reject it and consider it from the devil. Well, the reputation of the individual that created any new Jesus usually factored in to how successful the religious sect was going to be. Joe had just shot himself in both feet and stabbed himself in the back multiple times with all of his treasure-seeking and other get-rich-quick shenanigans, and he couldn't outrun his reputation living in New York. That's why the local newspaper articles we read considered the whole Golden Bible story bogus and created by the mind of a fraud. Well, Joe's reputation did escape some people that lived outside the reach of the negative tabloids and ended up coming to visit the Smith home. Of course, Joe was in harmony at these times, but his little minions had no problem being Joe's mouthpiece to any person that was interested in the Book of Mormon or Joe's theology. First, we'll read the account of a man named Thomas Baldwin Marsh. Originally from Massachusetts, Marsh was actually an early convert and faithful apostle to the church. This is also taken from The Rise of Mormonism by H. Michael Marquardt, and it is a first-hand autobiographical account. Quote, I returned back westward and found Martin Harris at the printing office in Palmyra where the first 16 pages of the Book of Mormon had just been struck off. The proof sheet of which I obtained from the printer and took with me. As soon as Martin Harris found out my intentions, he took me to the house of Joseph Smith Sr. Here, I found Oliver Cowdery, who gave me all the information concerning the book I desired. After staying there 2 days, I started for Charleston, Massachusetts, highly pleased with the information I had obtained concerning the newfound book. End quote. So this guy, Thomas Marsh, was living in Massachusetts and heard somebody talking about the Golden Bible. He must not have had anything better to do with his time, because after hearing this, he set on a journey to humble little Palmyra, New York. Upon arriving there, he was schooled by Ollie and the rest of the Smiths for a few days, and given the first 16 pages of the Book of Mormon that had just been completed, along with the title page, I assume, and then headed back to Massachusetts to proselyte the Book of Mormon and Mormonism to the nice people over there. This was one of the first recruits to the early missionary force of the Church of Christ. Thomas B. Marsh is a name that will come up periodically throughout all Mormon history, so keep in mind, this is where he came from, and this is how he became familiar with Mormonism in the first place. The next account we'll read is a little more powerful, and it's from a man by the name of Solomon Chamberlain. This is taken from his autobiography, and I pulled it from a website, boap.org, which is an online library and blog run by BYU. It's kind of long, but there's a lot to unpack, so let's allow Solomon Chamberlain to speak for himself. Quote, about the time that Joseph Smith had found the gold record, I began to feel that the time was drawing near, that the Lord would in some shape or other bring forth his church. I made some inquiry through the country where I traveled if there was any strange work of God, such as had not been on the earth since the days of Christ. I could hear of none. I was living about 20 miles east of where the gold record was found, on the Erie Canal. I had occasion to go on a visit into Upper Canada. I took a boat for Lockport. When the boat came to Palmyra, I felt as if some genie or good spirit told me to leave the boat. This was a few miles from where the record was found. After leaving the boat, the spirit manifested to me to travel a south course. I did for about 3 miles. I had not as yet heard of the Gold Bible, so-called, which was the Book of Mormon, nor any of the Joseph Smith family. I was a stranger in that part of the country, a town where I never before had set my foot and knew no one in the town. End quote. I think this ignorance has a lot to do with Chamberlain's credulity of what happens next. This guy was just on a mission from God, right? And he was looking for the right church because, like a lot of people, he was fed up with all of the sects that he had already joined. He was basically wandering New York aimlessly until he found some shit that would actually stick once thrown against the wall. If he had known the Smiths and their fraudulent treasure-seeking reputation, he probably wouldn't have even considered their claims worth giving the time of day to. But he was completely ignorant of the whole Golden Bible story and the Smith story in New York. So, he continued on his journey, and let's face it, he was bound to find something in this search. Whether the Smiths or the Millerites or some other religion, Chamberlain was going to find what he was looking for and record the situation in his autobiography. We're just lucky for what happened next because Chamberlain himself details the situation quite well. Quote, "It was about sundown, and my guide directed me to put up for the night, which I did to a farmhouse. In the morning, the people of the house asked me if I had heard of the Gold Bible. When they said Gold Bible, there was a power like electricity, went from the top of my head to the end of my toes. This was the first time I ever heard of the Gold Bible." End quote. All right, put yourself in Chamberlain's shoes. He's been searching for the truth for some time now, having been jaded by the usual fire and brimstone preachers that plagued the countryside. While on his journey through New York, the first house he bunks at for the night tells him about a new Bible that's been found. Not only that, but the Bible is reportedly made from gold, and it's an ancient account of Jesus in the new world that he was living in. Holy shit, how awesome would it be to be Chamberlain right now? Not only that, but listen to what he had to say next. Quote, "I was now within half a mile of the Smith family where Joseph lived. From the time I left the boat until now, I was wholly led by the spirit, or my genie," which he also called his guide earlier. "The woman spoke considerable of the Gold Bible that Joseph Smith had found. When she mentioned Gold Bible, I felt a shock of the power of God go from head to foot. I said to myself, I shall soon find why I have been led in this singular manner." End quote. If you were Chamberlain here, wouldn't you think you had stumbled onto God's path for you? He'd been wandering and happened upon somebody selling a new version of Jesus, and he felt a burning in his bosom, just like I do when I see an amazing view in Hawaii or take a miraculously intense shit, and he knew that this Gold Bible was his calling. Let's continue on with Chamberlain's account here. Quote, "I soon made my way across lots to Father Smith's and found Hiram walking the floor. As I entered the door, I said, 'Peace be to this house.' He looked at me as one astonished and said, 'I hope it will be peace.' I then said, 'Is there anyone here that believes in visions or revelations?' He said, 'Yes, we are a visionary house.' I said, 'Then I will give you one of my pamphlets, which was visionary and of my own experience.'" End quote. I don't think we can emphasize this conversation enough. Chamberlain walked into the Smith house and asked Hiram if anybody in the house believed in visions or revelations. I assume revelatory dreams were part of this too. Hiram replied that they were a visionary house. Wow, really, a visionary house. When somebody's called a visionary today, it's a derogatory comment. It means they see things in a vision that's, well, separate from reality, and they shouldn't be taken seriously. But these two guys talk about it like yesterday's breakfast. It's not hard to assume that being visionary was something of a common topic of conversation between folks back then. Nowadays, we talk about getting those people medication or professional help of some sort. But, as we'll read in a second, being a visionary household was some kind of weird social prestige and was played and fed on by other visionaries. It's like some kind of alternate reality circle jerk where everybody is believing what each other says no matter how crazy it is. Quote, "They then called the people together, which consisted of 5 or 6 men who were out at the door. Father Smith was one, and some of the Whitmers. They sat down and read my pamphlet. Hiram read first, but was so affected he could not read it. He then gave it to a man, which I learned was Christian Whitmer. He finished reading it. I then opened my mouth and began to preach to them in the words that the angel had made known to me in the vision, that all churches and denominations on the earth had become corrupt, and no church of God on the earth, but that he would shortly raise up a church that would never be confounded nor brought down, and be like unto the apostolic church. They wondered greatly who had been telling me these things. For, said they, we have the same things wrote down in our house, taken from the gold record, that you are preaching to us. I said. "The Lord told me these things a number of years ago." I then said, "If you are a visionary house, I wish you would make known some of your discoveries, for I think I can bear them." They then made known to me that they had obtained a gold record and just finished translating it here. Now the Lord revealed to me by the gift and power of the Holy Ghost that this was the work I had been looking for. End quote. And there it was. Typical confirmation bias driving somebody to sell their soul to a church, or a cult in this case. This guy was just looking for the real church because all the churches so far that he had joined were wrong. Joe was in the process of creating a church because all the churches so far were wrong, and these individuals came together to make a perfect little match. Is it really that miraculous? I mean, confirmation bias coincidences happen like this all the time. People are always looking for something, and other people usually have that something that's being sought for. When those people meet up, it's not because the stars aligned and God led them both to the same place at the same time. It's just a matter of statistical probabilities. Eventually, everybody will find something they're looking for that somebody else has, especially when it comes to something that's as vaguely defined as religion or a God claim. Mormons can use this as evidence that God was working in the lives of these men, but I'm sorry. It's pretty mundane and lame for a God to be involved in this situation. Random chance can be a fascinating field of study, especially when you try to add a meddling God into the mix. Or we can be realistic and take a step back and say, well, somebody was going to believe early Mormonism, and we're just lucky enough to have the autobiography of one of the people that did believe. Alright, let's finish up with Solomon Chamberlain's account here, because there's one big thing we need to discuss before closing up the history portion of today's episode. Quote, "Here I stayed 2 days, and they instructed me in the manuscripts of the Book of Mormon. After I had been there 2 days, I went with Hiram and some others to Palmyra printing office, where they began to print the Book of Mormon, and as soon as they had printed 64 pages, I took them with their leave and pursued my journey to Canada, and I preached all that I knew concerning Mormonism to all, both high and low, rich and poor, and thus, you see, this was the first that ever printed Mormonism was preached to this generation." End quote. I hate to rain on this guy's parade, but the other account we read by Thomas Marsh happened a little while before this chronologically, and he only took 16 pages of print to go proselyte in Massachusetts, because that's all that had been printed by the time he left. But Chamberlain was probably the first to go up to Canada to preach Mormonism, so I suppose we can give him that. Anyway, we'll hear more about Chamberlain if he makes himself relevant in the future, but for now, that'll do. These were some amazing and compelling accounts by these two seekers. That is, if, we factor out the whole thing about random chance and stuff. But let's get into what Joe was up to during this time. For this information, we'll be turning to an interview that Hiram Page gave to William E. McClellan in 1848. It sheds some very interesting light on Joe's opinion of his own book and his true motives, and I think it allows us to get inside Joe's head for a short time. This is also taken from The Rise of Mormonism, page 153 to 154, but it was originally pulled from a photocopy of the original handwritten interview in the RLDS archives in Missouri. Quote, "Joseph heard that there was a chance to sell a copyright in Canada for any useful book that was used in the States. Joseph thought this would be a good opportunity to get a handsome sum of money, which was to be, after the expenses were taken out, for the exclusive benefit of the Smith family, and was to be at the disposal of Joseph. Accordingly, Oliver Cowdery, Joseph Knight, Hiram Page, and Josiah Stowell were chosen, as I understood by revelation, to do the business. We were living from some 30 to 100 miles apart. The necessary preparation was made by them in a sly manner, so as to keep Martin Harris from drawing a share of the money. It was told me we were to go by revelation, but when we assembled at Father Smith's, there was no revelation for us to go. but we were all anxious to get a revelation to go. And when it came, we were to go to Kingston, where we were to sell if they would not harden their hearts. But when we got there, there was no purchaser. Neither were they authorized at Kingston to buy rights for the province. But Little York was the place where such business had to be done. We were to get $8,000. We were treated with the best of respects by all we met within Kingston. By the above, we may learn how a revelation may be received and the person receiving it not be benefited. End quote. Alright, so what the hell did we just read? Basically, Joe tried to sell the copyright for the Book of Mormon in Canada for $8,000 while the book was being printed. Joe wouldn't make the trek himself. I mean, he had better things to do. So he gathered 4 of his minions, Ollie Cowdung Allover, Joseph Knight Sr., Hiram Page, and boss man Josiah Stowell. And they all collected enough provisions and some change for their travels and headed to the Smith's house in Palmyra, where Joe gathered with them at the time. It's unclear whether Joe was living in Harmony or Palmyra at this time, but we are certain that they gathered at Father Smith's house. These 4 cronies were under the impression that Joe had a line on somebody that was willing to buy the copyright, and they expected a revelation from God to be waiting for them when they gathered at the Smiths. That, of course, would detail where they needed to go and who they needed to talk to. You can only imagine the depression and anxiety that ran through the group when they found out that no such revelation existed. The group basically refused to leave until Joe tossed Precious and Mr. Hat and gave them the revelation they were looking for. They did all of this without alerting Not-So-Smarty Marty, because if he found out that Joe was trying to sell the copyright out from under him, it would ruin Joe's reputation and convictions in Marty's eyes, and Marty might just cut off the funding for the book. Besides, there was nothing saying that Smiths had to repay Marty for the book if they didn't own the rights to the book, so that $8,000 would have been Joe's free and clear, legally speaking, of course, had everything worked out in Joe's favor. So, the group left without Marty's knowledge and headed for Kingston, Canada, which is just on the northeast side of the Lake Ontario from the Palmyra-Rochester area in New York, a couple days' journey by foot and ferry. When the group got there, supposedly under assignment and revelation from God, nobody there knew what the fuck they were talking about. The people there couldn't even figure out who they needed to talk to in order to get that $8,000 figure, and they just sent the group packing to another part of Canada called Little York. After that, we don't know if the group just returned to New York or if they went to Little York to procure the monies or what they did for that matter, but we do know they returned empty-handed. I think the platitude that Hiram Page closed his remarks with sums it up really nicely. Quote, "By the above, we may learn how a revelation may be received and the person receiving it not be benefited." End quote. So, at least the 4 guys had a good time while they were in Canada, and if that's the only benefit that can be taken from this wasted week on chasing a wild goose, then it's just alright in Hiram's book. But Joe wasn't satisfied with this utter failure, and of course he organized a second trip, presumably without the knowledge of Not-So-Smarty Marty once again. This was in a letter from William E. McClellan to Joseph Smith III, written in 1872. So it's a while after the fact, but it still holds a lot of relevance because it's written by one of the primary church historians for the RLDS. We'll get into McClellan when he makes his way into the church in 1831, but for now, we can take what he says with a fair amount of credibility. Quote, "But again, Joseph Smith had a revelation for Oliver Cowdery and friends to go to Canada to get a copyright secured in that dominion to the Book of Mormon. It proved so false that he never would have it recorded, printed, or published. I have seen and read a copy of it, so I know it existed." End quote. So, Basically, Joe gathered everybody together again, and once again issued a revelation using his best buddies, Precious and Mr. Hat, telling the group that this time they would totally be successful. That $8,000 must have had Joe's fangs watering by now. If we calculate that out to today's inflation, it would be just over $205,000. It's no wonder Joe was trying to get this sale done. If he were successful in selling the copyright, it would set him and the entire Smith family up for the rest of their lives. Put yourself in Joe's shoes. What's easier? Publishing the Book of Mormon, starting your own religion, having your cult chased out of multiple towns and cities, pushed through multiple hardships of money and other necessities, and end up ultimately getting shot like a rat in a cage in Carthage? Or just making up a book and selling the copyright to somebody else for some fat stacks and quick payoff? Which would you do? Which do you think was really Joe's plan from the beginning? Well, unfortunately, nobody will ever get to see these revelations that he issued regarding these trips to Canada, so we won't know for sure. They were so embarrassingly false that he refused to print or publish them, which is a damn shame because from a scholarly perspective, I would love to read those revelations. And of course, from a non-scholarly perspective, I would just love to read them so I could call Joe a bold-faced, egotistical, underhanded liar. But I suppose I can still do that without reading the false revelations. To sum it all up, D-Day David Whitmer wrote in his address to all believers in Christ this little gem that offers a view into Joe's personality. Joseph was at my father's house when they returned, meaning the group that went to Canada the second time. I was there also, and am an eyewitness to these facts. Jacob Whitmer and John Whitmer were also present when Hiram Page and Oliver Cowdery returned from Canada. Well, we are all in great trouble, and we asked Joseph how it was that he had received a revelation from the Lord for some brethren to go to Toronto and sell the copyright, and the brethren had utterly failed in their understanding. And Joseph did not know how it was. So he inquired of the Lord about it. And behold, the following revelation came through the stone. Now he's quoting the revelation itself. Quote, "Some revelations are of God, some revelations are of man, and some revelations are of the devil." End quote. Now going back to David Whitmer, quote, "So we see that the revelation to go to Toronto and sell the copyright was not of God, but was of the devil or of the heart of man." End quote. How in the fuck was this not a huge red flag to everybody in the room? They had gone twice to Canada to try and sell the rights to publishing the Book of Mormon and twice failed. Both times the group was working from revelations from the almighty God of the fucking universe, spoken through his earthly conduit Joseph Smith, and Joe just comes up with a new revelation from Precious, saying that some revelations are of God and others aren't. How could you possibly trust this narcissistic, lying fuck after something like that? If Joe was waving a red flag that big and bright in the face of his followers and they still continued to follow him, I have very little sympathy for whatever happened to them after that. This was a cop-out and a really poor makeshift one at that. Well, with these failures of trying to get rich quick, Joe was forced to follow through with publishing the Book of Mormon and establishing his church, whether he planned on it or not. In this episode, we covered the timeline from Not-So-Smarty Marty signing the agreement with Egbert B. Grandin for publishing the Book of Mormon in August 1829, and moved all the way through the sequence of events until the Book of Mormon was first offered for sale on March 26, 1830, 11 days before the first congregation of the church. We're almost 9 months into this bi-monthly podcast, and the timeline has finally advanced to the point that the Book of Mormon was actually published and ready to spread like the newest wildfire to scorch the burned-over district with Joe's radical new claims on God and mortality. Things are about to get really exciting. Before getting into the listener mail segment and the Patreon shoutouts, I want to talk a little bit about the plans for the show. This is episode 20, and with the community that has evolved around the show, I want to just say thank you to everybody that's listening and contributing in some way. The Facebook page is a central hub for really crazy Mormon shit, and thank you, Demonista, for running that. And I'm constantly getting encouraging emails, and patronage is higher than it's ever been. So just thank you so much, everybody, for everything that you're doing. It's become a very rewarding experience. Now, I know that some episodes have been better than others, and when I go back and listen to the first episodes, I just cringe and laugh at what I'm hearing. The show has come quite a long way, and I plan on sticking to my guns to perpetuate its growth and presence in the podcasting world. That being said, I hope that all the listeners have come to some kind of understanding about the pace of the show. Honestly, with how much information is out there on Mormon church history, and with how much depth I like to examine things, this could truly be a never-ending endeavor. Like I said earlier, 9 months in, and all we've covered so far is timid little swindler Joe getting his precious little book up and running by any means necessary. We've only introduced a small fraction of the important characters up to this point, and there are quite a few people I've left out just for the sake of not confusing the equation too much. With what's coming up in the history, it'll make everything up to this point seem as lame as a carrot stuck in a vat of green jello, but the problem with examining everything with as much detail as we do, we run into a bit of a catch-22. What I mean is, there's a lot of really amazing and dark things in the history of the church, but a lot of them don't come up for a long time, if we're sticking to a linear timeline format. For example, the horrible Mountain Meadows Massacre didn't happen until 13 years after Joe's death, and Joe dies in 14 years from where the timeline currently stands. I want the information about what happened during these horrible times to be available to all, but it seems out of place to have an episode about something that happened 27 years ahead of where we are right now, just plopped somewhere randomly in between other historical episodes that are following the timeline. Even more than the exciting things in the history, I also want to cover current Mormon news topics. For example, last week, Boyd K. Packer, one of the most virulent homophobes in the apostleship, died at the age of 90. I want to do an episode covering his life and some of his more memorable sermons, but I'm not sure where to fit it in, or if everybody would even be interested in an episode like that. So I'm petitioning all listeners for their opinion. Would everybody prefer that I occasionally take a break from the historical timeline to do some special edition episodes on these darker and more current topics? Or do you just want to wait for the timeline to get to that point and it'll be covered with the highest level of detail that's been devoted to the timeline up to this point? Honestly, I see pros and cons with doing it both ways, but I'm sure there's a middle ground there that will satisfy the majority of listeners. Personally, I think these topics can be covered with a couple of special edition episodes and then examined in much more depth when it comes up in the timeline. For example, we could do a single special edition episode that's just about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, but then when it comes up in the timeline, we could spend 2 or 3 episodes on covering the politics, event, and the aftermath in much greater detail. That seems like it could be the most beneficial, but I'm looking for any possible way to keep the show interesting and relevant at the same time. We want your suggestions, so please go to the Naked Mormonism Facebook page and leave a comment or message, or you can email directly to nakedmormonism@gmail.com. If you have any ideas about how to make the show better in this respect, or in any way for that matter. I'm always open to suggestions, and I'm looking forward to communicating with everybody to hopefully improve the show. That being said, there is some listener mail that we need to take care of. First off, we received an email from David. He said, a heads up, have you heard of the Boise Rescue? I want to say it's a Mormon Stories podcast, episode number 547 or thereabouts. Honestly, I had no idea that this was even a thing. I didn't even know about the Swedish rescue that was a precursor to this Boise rescue. But I did listen to the Mormon Stories podcast about it, and it looks like it was just a special edition in between episode 546 and 47. So it's just a sermon where Richard E. Turley, who is the head Mormon historian, and Dallin H. Oaks, who's a current apostle of the church, basically tag team it and talk about some of the challenging things in the history of the church, and then trade off fear-mongering, basically, and telling people that they need to be on the right side of history and not the wrong side that leads people to apostasy. It's quite a fascinating listen. It's just over an hour and a half, and I recommend anybody that wants to understand why indoctrination is the way it is in the church, to just give it a listen. You really start to pick up on the little details and the things that they say that are kind of cues as to why people kind of shy away from the history and don't really talk about it much. It's a whitewashing, and it's really fascinating to see it right in action. And they in fact, they do a little exchange where they go back and forth, where Oakes asks some challenging questions about Mormon history, and then Turley gives a perfect apologetic answer to the history. Well, I mean, yeah, I guess it's perfect if you're on their side and you're listening to it, you're like, oh, well, that is a good answer. But when I listened to it, it just blew my mind, thinking that people would actually be satisfied with these answers. So, David, thank you for sending in an email about that. I was completely unaware, and I feel very... I should say enlightened, but it's more like I feel dumber for listening to it, so thanks for making me aware of it. It was good fun. Next, there was an email from Joshua. His email said basically that he kind of disagrees with my interpretation of Emma as being the submissive and victimized wife of Joe. And he said, now I don't disagree. He wants to add that wasn't it possible that she didn't want to see what was under the cloth covering the plates? I think I have to agree with you a little bit on that, Joshua. She seems like she has a very dynamic personality, and it's really hard to try and get a grasp on just what Emma was about. But I think at a certain level, she was aware that Joe was doing some things that she didn't agree with or approve of, and I don't think she had any idea what was coming on down the line. I don't think anybody did. So honestly, I think it's kind of like when guys get into hobbies and their wives just don't want to deal with it, or they just don't care. Just okay, go through the phase, have fun with this little hobby, and then I know you're going to be done with it in 6 months, so just whatever happens. I think that's kind of what Emma's deal was for a little while there, and then just as it got bigger and snowballed into this bigger and uglier mess, I think she got to a point where she couldn't turn back, or she would be ostracized and cast out as Joe's wife. And I think she also believed a lot of what Joe said, so if that did happen, then she wouldn't get into heaven. So I think she was kind of entrapped, basically, by Joe, and maybe her own subconscious not wanting to know the truth, whether the truth was positive or negative, in comparison to Joe's claims. So yeah, I think I agree with you, Joshua, and you go on to say, the same goes for Not So Smarty Marty. I agree. He is a guy that did choose to live in a magical world. I mean, he even told us about when he was walking in the woods one day, and there was a deer that was apparently Jesus incarnate in a deer, and he walked and talked with it for about 15 minutes. So I think he was... he probably had a couple of screws loose, and he really, really wanted what Joe was saying to be true. So yeah, I think he chose a lot of his own shit too. But I still don't think that either of them were fully informed on the situation when they could have taken other measures to become more informed. And for that, I do fault them to a certain level. If somebody is wanting to know the truth, that genuinely wanting to know the truth, they'll examine everybody's claims with as little bias as possible. These people seem like they wanted to believe what Joe was saying, regardless of the consequences of it, and they did so. And, Marty's life got ruined. Emma ended up being one of 33 other wives. I mean, her life became completely ruined by it, and it's kind of sad to see situations like this where people would much rather embrace a falsehood that's comforting as opposed to seeking out the truth because of unwanted consequences. But yes, good email, Joshua. I enjoyed that. Thank you. There was another email from Mike. Very simple. Could you put sources of the information that you're giving on the podcast? On the earlier episodes, I was really, really bad with that. I was not citing my sources very well. But now in the later episodes that you listen to, I'm getting to the point where I'm citing the source right before I read it or after I read it. And then if there is an important link or something to that effect that leads you to a website where I get a lot of my information for any given thing, I usually try and include that in the show notes. So any episodes that you're listening to, look at the show notes and see if there's a link that you might be looking for in there. There's usually a lot more information on these websites than I just scratch the surface when I'm talking about it in the show. So I recommend checking out the show notes for those links. We got a couple emails from Thomas. The first email said that he was afraid that there wasn't much hope of getting people to leave the church, and then 3 of his sister's children called out of the blue and told me they had left the church and become atheists. And he ends the email with, "There is hope, and I think non-believers are starting to win. Keep up the good work. It is appreciated." Thomas, hell yeah, I agree. And the only way that we can possibly get people to leave the church or at least examine what they truly believe is by spreading the virus of critical thinking. And it's a good virus to have. I recommend it for everybody. 10 out of 10 skeptics recommend skepticism as a worldview. Thomas, keep your hopes up. I think the more that there are people that leave the church, the more the people on the inside begin to ask, so why did these people leave? Was it something that happened, or is it because of something in the doctrine? And they really start to question what's going on. And I think that all in all, that's going to end up being the death of the church. Thomas's second email said that he forgot to mention he spent a great deal of time looking into the similarities between the temple ceremony and Masonic rituals. Yes, indeed. There are an immense amount of parallels there, down to the wording and the chanting and the clothing. When we talk about Joseph and Hiram becoming Master Masons, that's when we're going to start digging into the Masonic rituals. And when Joe actually introduced the temple ceremony, he actually had become a Master Mason only 3 weeks prior to it. So there are a lot of deep connections in between the two, and we're definitely going to get into those when it becomes relevant in the timeline. I think that's it for listener mail. Next, we needed to thank our newest patrons. There are some new NAMO juvenile delinquents to thank: Isabel, David L., and D. Wayne. Thank you all so much for your support. Your journey through the ranks of the NAMO Kingdom are off to a great start. Also, Isabel sent an email saying that she enjoys the show and has a podcast of her own called Le Monde Merveilleux du Scepticisme. I can't French good. Meaning the wonderful world of skepticism. The whole podcast is in French, so if any listeners do understand French and want to hear Isabel's take on skepticism, head over to her show. I'm sorry, Isabel, I will not be listening to your show because, like I said, I can't really French for shit. Next, there were a few NAMO adolescent rebels to thank: Gray, Daniel, and Dawn. Thank you all so much for your support. You gallant guys are exactly 0% more or less awesome than juvenile delinquents, but exactly 100% more supportive, and for that reason, you'll always have a special place in the heart of the podcast. I really appreciate your generosity. Next to thank are the newest NAMO apostates, David and Nicholas. These gentlemen saw the preceding levels of NAMO glory and decided they just weren't enough to truly capture how amazing and epic they really are. Thank you guys for being a fifth pillar of the show and helping to support the time and research that goes into the podcast. Your donations help to fund the NAMO Information Kingdom into perpetuity, and for that you have my undying gratitude. Things are all good and well in the realm of reality, but there's a new presence in the NAMO Outer Darkness realm. Mary is a hardworking professional. that doesn't like to have any downtime in her life. She coaches the local recreational soccer team, she's head of the community school council, and she's a volunteer firefighter. She's always had a talented go-getter of a personality that people are magnetized to. Small-town communities are a gift in some ways. Everybody knows everybody, and you never have to go far to run into a genuinely good friend. That's the spirit of community that drives Mary to be on the volunteer fire department for the community. The unfortunate part of being on the department is the inherent risks that come with fighting fires. There's simply no escaping that fact. However, the rewarding sense attained when somebody's life is saved by Mary's actions motivate her to stare fiery death in the face without so much as a flinch. It's been a couple of weeks since she's last been called to a house fire, and Mary knows that one has to happen sooner or later. The weather's been hot and dry, and it's just a matter of time until a flicked cigarette butt or backyard grilling party goes awry. Well, it happened on Mary's fateful translation night. She had just finished making dinner for herself when the call rang out. There was a condo fire just down the street from Mary's home. She knew the family that was inside, as they had been the first people to bring over a plate of cookies when she moved into the neighborhood years ago. Mary cherished their friendship and couldn't stand the thought of any of them being in danger. Mary suited up in her firefighting garb and ran out her front door, leaving her dinner to get cold on the table. She ran down the street towards the blazing inferno that used to be a home. She looked in all directions around the house and couldn't see the family anywhere. Their car was in the driveway, but none of them were standing outside watching the house burn to the ground. A sinking fear settled into the pit of Mary's stomach. What if the family's still inside? Her worst fear was confirmed when she heard a support beam from the roof crash to the floor of the condo, and she heard a little girl scream out of fright. Mary was frozen. If somebody didn't act fast, the entire family stuck inside would be consumed before the fire trucks even got there to put the fire out. Against her better judgment, Mary pulled her helmet's plastic shield down to guard her beautiful face and stunning eyes from any damage during the heroic stunt she was about to attempt. She runs at the door, dropping her shoulder into a full charge, and smashes through the front of the door and tucks into a perfect roll onto the kitchen tile. She gets up to a crouch and her mind grasps the severity of the fire. Every single flat surface was ablaze. All the windows had been cooked out of their panes, fueling the fire with fresh oxygen to burn. There were wall studs falling from their place in the sheetrock of the walls. Roof joists were crashing through the ceiling with loud snaps and bangs. Everything was going up in flames, and the house would be completely consumed in less than a minute. Mary calls out to the family and hears a faint cry for help coming from the back bedroom. She charges through the falling debris and drops her shoulder in for another slam. This door isn't as brittle as the front door was, and it doesn't budge with her shoulder charge. She grabs the door handle and her glove melts to the red-hot metal. She takes her hand out of the glove to keep it safe from being melted to the door, just like the glove was. And when, without missing a beat, Mary grabs a small hatchet from her tool belt. She takes a wild swing at the wooden panel door right next to the handle and inflicts a small wound to the wood, just to the side of the handle. That wasn't enough, and she knew it. The danger of the situation really starts to kick in as she hears the family screaming behind the door. A massive rush of adrenaline pumps into Mary's veins, and she takes a second swing at the door. The hatchet collides with the door, and the wood around the handle splinters into a useless pile of broken wood. Mary kicks the door open with heroic force. The family looks up at Mary, stunned by her amazing display of power. She yells at them to get a move on and follow her. The family falls into line behind Mary as she leads them through the smoldering house to the front door. She stands at the doorway and pushes each person out the front door to ensure their safety and get a count on everybody. As the whole family, down to the last child, runs through the flaming door to the safe outdoors, Mary's heart sinks again. Somebody is missing from the group. Mary follows the family outside and yells to them, asking about little Todd. They tell her they don't know, but they think he's inside. Mary doesn't wait for a second and runs back into the inferno. There are sirens down the road, but they still won't get here in time to help save little Todd. She yells for him and listens for a response. There's a muffled yell, in the smaller bedroom next to the one she broke into earlier. The smoke is so thick, but Mary's on top of her game. She knows right where to go to find the terrified child. Mary wasn't going to worry about wasting time with the hatchet. She instead kicks the door as soon as she reaches the room. Weakened so much by the fire, the door flies off its hinges and tumbles into the smoke-filled room. In Mary's experience, she knows that kids hide in closets when they're afraid. She enters the room and turns to the left to find the closet door closed. She hears a whimpering Todd behind it and knows she's found her target. Without any care for the future use of her hand, Mary grabs the door handle and twists to fling the door open. Huddled in a tiny ball on the floor is a terrified little Todd, and Mary's heart instantly skips a beat. He's going to be okay if they can just get out of the house. Mary bends over and picks up Todd, who's frozen from fear, and spins around towards the open bedroom door. She tries to lunge out of the frame that used to house a bedroom door, but there's a loud crash. A 500-pound support joist falls from the ceiling and smashes to the floor right in front of Mary and Todd. She pauses as the fear of mortality overcomes her adrenaline high for a split second. She can't let fear of death cause both her and Todd to die tonight. And Mary suppresses the doubts long enough to jump over the burning joist and run into the kitchen. The smoke is so thick now, it's impossible to see where Mary's going. She's making her way to the front door from what she remembers of the house before. A loud crack over Mary's head overpowers the sound of the burning inferno, and time slows to a fraction of normal speed. Everything is happening so slowly, and Mary can comprehend her thoughts so clearly. There's even a break in the smoke where she can see the open front door a mere 10 feet away. The loud crack overhead was another support joist giving in to the weakening force of the fire. As Mary is running to the front door in slow motion, Todd securely in her arms, the burning joist crashes through the ceiling. Mary was able to get most of her body out of the way, but the massive beam falls on top of Mary's calf, pinning her to the ground. She shakes Todd and tells him to run for the door. She could tell he was completely disoriented and they had no time to lose. She sets him down on his back on the tile floor and pushes him across the floor as hard as she can. Todd slides to the open front door, jumps up and runs to the safety of his parents' open arms. But our heroine is still trapped. She can't free her leg. She lays on her back to try and push it off with the free leg, but the joist is simply too heavy. Mary comes to grips with the fact that she may have sacrificed her life to save that small child. A simple peace overcomes the adrenaline coursing through her bloodstream, and Mary looks around at the burning inferno that would undoubtedly become her resting place. Everything was happening so slowly, and Mary began to contemplate life in general. She came to an understanding that this life is all we have, and that's just fine. If we can devote our lives to helping each other, that can be reason enough to live. She had given her life for the sake of many others, and she was okay with this being her final moment of glory. Just as this thought crossed Mary's mind, another roof support beam cracks right above her head. This was the end. Another loud crack, and the ceiling gave way above her head. She watched in slow motion as the sheetrock above her face exploded under the weight of the beam. It was falling straight down and was about to crush her once and for all. Mary put up one hand and turned her head to the side in a futile effort to stop the inevitable. Just as she turned her head, she saw something that was brighter and more enchanting than anything else in the room. Mary no longer thought of her own life, but was completely absorbed by the beauty and mysteriousness of the glowing talisman floating peacefully just above the ground right next to her face. What is it? What could it mean? Yames is very pleased with the selfless actions Mary had just displayed, and whispered in the sinister small voice.
Take it.
Mary reached out and grabbed the glowing talisman, and there was nothing but silence. The beam crashed down right on where Mary was trapped, and the rest of the building folded like a plastic bag in the fire. The neighbors were screaming for Mary, but no cries of agony would be heard from the house tonight. Nobody will ever know exactly what happened to Mary. All that would be found of her was her name badge torn from the sleeve of her firefighting suit, charred but still legible, right where she laid before her translation. Thank you for your support, Mary, and welcome to the Outer Darkness as our newest Nemo demon. Your support is deeply appreciated and will go a long way to help keep the show going. Thank you for being so awesome and for listening to the show. One more thing to mention before closing it up tonight. I was on the most recent episode of The Scathing Atheist, that's episode 126. No Illusions, host of The Scathing Atheist, was nice enough to have a conversation with me about my favorite topic, Joseph Smith. We talked about the Carthage jail death, but actually the entire interview isn't up. We talked about it long enough that he had to split it up into 2 different episodes. So episode 126 is just the first part leading up to the Carthage jail scene and all the politics involved. And episode 127, which comes out on July 23rd, will have the conclusion of the Carthage jail shootout. I encourage everybody to go check that episode out. It was a lot of fun doing the interview. And if you haven't heard Scathing Atheist yet, check that show out. It is amazing. Noah, Heath, and Lucinda do a great job and put on a great show that's been running in the game for quite some time now. They're really, really cool people. I actually had the opportunity to meet them at ReasonCon and hang out with them for a while. It was good fun. It was good to meet other podcasters face to face like that. But check that episode out. I'll leave a link to that episode in the show notes for this episode. Well, I think that's everything for this episode. I hope you join us next time when we talk about the first congregation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Fayette, New York, or the first congregation of the Church of Christ in Manchester, New York, or it's one of those somewhere, and we're going to find out. We're going to talk about it. But yeah, that's it. I hope to talk at you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast.